Welcome to InSolidarity, a Seva Cooperative Federation podcast. Seva Cooperative Federation has been working for over 30 years to economically empower women in the informal sector through worker-owned cooperatives and collective enterprises. To put it quite simply, we work as a women's enterprise support system to promote and strengthen grassroots women's enterprises. Through this series of podcasts, we hope to cover themes that are of importance to informal women workers and their cooperatives and collective enterprises, and how we can create an enabling environment for women's enterprises to thrive.
अभी तो बहुत बड़ा सपना है हमारा।
मुझे कामनी बहुत जरूरत है, मैंने ले जाओ।
अब हम लोग के पास कैपिटल आ गया, अब हम लोग खुल के करेंगे बिजनेस।
સમયમાં તો જોવા જઈએ તો આપણે બધો કામમાં જ સમય જાય છે, પોતાના માટે સમય કાઢવો બહુ મુશ્કેલ હોય છે।
अभी हम लोग मतलब ये पैसा राउंड होते होते हम लोग 12-13 लाख का बिजनेस चल रहा है।
You've tuned in to InSolidarity, a Seva Cooperative Federation podcast. My name is Priyanka.
And my name is Saloni. And joining us today on episode 2, titled Changing the Lens, Communicating Women's Lives and Livelihoods, is P Sainath. Hitakshi Ben, a farmer and board member of Megha Adivasi Women's Cooperative from Tapi, South Gujarat, says,
जो भाई હોય છે ખેત મજૂરનું કામ કરે છે પણ 12 કલાક ઓછામાં ઓછું કામ કરે છે પણ બહેનો હોય છે તે 24 કલાક કામ કરે છે।
Men work for 10 hours a day on the field or as laborers, but women, we work 24 hours a day. In the field, in our homes, and with the increased burden of unpaid work. Even when we go to sleep, we're thinking about the children or what needs to be done on the farm the next day. But when the newspaper covers farmers, they only seem to cover men. And it makes me really sad. Women do the same work, if not more, and we're as capable. Why then is our work not visible?
A report by UN Women in partnership with media watchdog Newslaundry revealed that men controlled over 80% of TV panel slots and 75% of the bylines in the Indian mainstream media. Women in general, but especially conversations around informality and women's work, are practically missing from the media and policy and development landscape. Economic status, informality, caste, urban versus rural add several layers to this conversation about visibility of informal women's lives and livelihoods.
And this despite the growing feminization of agriculture and the major contribution of the agrarian economy, rural India, and our women farmers to the national economy. How then do we recognize women farmers, enable them to tell their stories, and ensure that the gains of the digital economy, or agri-tech as it seems to be growing, reaches our farmers, reaches our women, and no one is left behind? Are collective models, such as women-owned cooperatives, the answer?
P Sainath is an Indian columnist and author of Everybody Loves a Good Drought. A recipient of the Ramon Magsaysay Award, he is founder of the People's Archive of Rural India, a digital journal and archive covering the everyday lives of everyday people. We are absolutely delighted to have him join us on this episode of InSolidarity to discuss changing the lens, communicating women's lives and livelihoods. Welcome, Mr. Sainath, and it is an honor and privilege to have you in the studio with us today. Both Saloni and I are absolutely delighted that we get to have a conversation with you.
My pleasure.
I'm going to start with the first question. We'll talk a little bit about informality. You see, informality in India is pervasive, and women form a major proportion of informal workers. Now, we know that these workers are left unprotected by the state, they are exploited in the private market, and they've continued to remain poor through generations. It is also true that women experience informality differently from men. In your experience, what are these critical differences and why is it important to talk about it?
Well, I think the first thing is that you've always had these gaps and inequalities, but you've had 31 years of economic policy entrenching those and introducing new inequalities besides deepening already entrenched ones. So that's one of the first problems. The second is it's very, very central that we look at if you're trying to tell anybody's stories, the share of unpaid work. Because that's not just the money, it affects everything else. It affects the time available to women to do other things, but the unpaid care work, looking after others, looking after that home. The ILO estimate of that and interpreted by Oxfam is that women and girls contribute unpaid labor annually, unpaid care work, the equivalent of $12.8 trillion.
Wow.
That is, trillion is 12 zeros. I can't fit it in my head. The 12.8 trillion, that amount is much greater than the size of the global tech industry. Yeah. And if you take the top 10 tech majors, it's probably 3 times their size. You know, when we think of informal, mostly we think of the construction labor, agricultural labor, all of this. But there are a million forms of... Now, when have you ever seen a man collect cow dung? Cow dung saves this country tens of billions of dollars each year in substituting the fossil fuels which you would otherwise import. There is no proper estimate, but it's in tens of billions of dollars. Now, I'm not singing in praise of cow dung. I think it's a terrible thing. Women pick up incredible amount of ailments from breathing that poisons in the cow dung. And in fact, a woman in a closed hut using cow dung is exposed to more health hazards than a factory worker in a bad factory. So I'm not praising that, but the fact is you bloody well recognize it. Why doesn't it happen? Well, cow dung isn't listed on the stock exchange. Though a lot of bullshit is. maybe it's maybe it's that gender discrimination thing there. So but yeah, so that's the thing. They it's not listed on the stock exchange, and work at home and the care work isn't listed on the stock exchange either. And anything that is not paid is not factored into your gross domestic product. Right? So you are actually concealing the contribution of God knows how many hundreds of billions of dollars. Cow dung is just one small thing. How many trillions of rupees we conceal from by not calculating the value of women's work.
Mr. Sainath, how do we begin telling the stories of women as workers? What are some things from your experience to keep in mind to represent women as they see themselves?
Whatever you said about the media is true, but in the People's Archive of Rural India, I think the largest focus on labor is on women's labor. One of, I'll tell you about telling the stories. One of our only full-time photographer. Now, he himself comes from a family of agricultural laborers. So there's a lot of empathy. The photo story he did on women seaweed harvesters of the coast of Ramanathapuram. Now, these seaweed harvesters, it's astonishing. I mean, even the way the story begins, that there's this bunch of women who get out of their homes at 4 a.m. or 4:30 a.m. and walk straight into their office, which is the sea a couple of hundred yards away. They're from the fishing community. Now they dive, as the seaweed has receded, they dive 3 meters, 4 meters, 6 meters. Sometimes they go far out on boats to islands from where they are now prohibited by the forest department and dive there 6 meters or so. Palani Kumar, went out with them, dived into the water with, I think, some of his equipment wrapped in plastic, and he has shot their work underwater up to 4 to 6 meters underwater. And I don't believe he had the goggles which they had. So, I mean, that, the thing about telling the story, first and foremost, is that we shouldn't be telling the story. They should be telling the story. Yeah, we use our, training, our skills, our knowledge to give context to what they are doing. But let them tell you about it. Yeah. So telling the story is the first thing, is gaining confidence. And they have to recognize they have to find you credible. So you're credible. Language is a second problem. It's not the first, as many people think. I speak 5 languages equally badly. But it's a matter of communication. I don't see language as anything more than that, except when I write in English. And even then, the priority is communication. You need to know the rhythms and routines of that labor. Now, that was what I did and still do whenever I'm doing a woman's story. You cannot get the half of it if you're not staying in the community, preferably in her house, and you get up in the morning when she does, which I do, and I'm a guy who goes to bed around the time they wake up. So the first half hour goes outside in swearing. And then you think, actually, it's very nice and cool. I should be doing this more often. But the first hour is completely bitter. And they are not thinking about the pleasant stuff or anything, though they like it, but they're too busy working. One of our 4 important mandates in PARI is generate journalism amongst the communities conventionally excluded from it.
Right. I'm going to pick up one thing you said. Early on you said, unpaid work isn't listed. Cow dung isn't listed, unpaid work isn't listed. And I want to bring to you something that Hitakshi Ben said. We have a recording, but it's in Gujarati, so I'll translate it.
અમુક બહેનોની માનસિક સ્થિતિ એવી છે કે અમે તો ખાલી ગૃહિણી છે.
Women, my sisters, my fellow farmers, we think of ourselves as grahini. We are household bearers or household workers. Although we have the capacity to earn, our work isn't seen to have value. Care isn't seen to have value. But she's also seen that if there is, say, one other woman on television or one other woman in a newspaper, and women in her community see that, they get inspiration and these stories start coming up. This is what she says. So given that the work is invisible, given that a woman holds multiple identities, given that counting farmers in surveys is linked to land ownership and women don't nearly have enough land in their names. How do we begin recording? How do we begin counting? And what you said, of course, goes to that effect also. But if you can talk to us a little bit about this.
How do you put the value? I think there are economists like Jayati Ghosh, etc., who have been working, far more competent than I am to tell you about that. But it means that we have to absolutely, in the first sense, dismiss the present idea of growth and the present constitution of the GDP. I'm saying I think it's worthless. Suppose when you constructed this building, you added to growth. Now if you demolish this building, you will add to growth because it's paid economic activity. Growth has become such a stupid idea. All that it meant, its originators never intended it to be used politically and as a class war tool in the way it is now. They simply defined it as the aggregate of your economic activities. Then you have to get in, then for the purposes we are using it now, you then have to get into what is the economic, what constitutes an economic activity. Then you say it's paid, right? And then you rule out women. So that whole thing, if you want to change it, you have to, the American ecologist Edward Abbey, The Monkey Wrench Gang, most famous book, he put it all in one line. He said, growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. That grows. Yeah. And when it grows beyond a point, you're dead. So, whereas there have been huge debates over that from the time of Growth with Fairness or John Kenneth Galbraith, who argued for growth with distribution and growth with justice. I think absolutely the best I have heard has come from Professor Prabhat Patnaik, the economist, who says, it's not enough to have growth with justice. You have to have growth through justice. And that's the only one that will make any sense. Otherwise, all this stuff of the numbers of growth, they are in one sense useful. When you're talking about the inequalities, the gender inequalities, when you're talking about what women are enduring and how you are to tackle that, you first have to recognize the context in which those inequalities are growing rapidly. See, there was a feminization of agriculture, and there's been a reversal of that with lots of people dropping out, also women dropping out also. And it's changed both ways at different times. I think the big thing that's missing is placing it in the context of the greatest inequality levels independent India has ever seen. And wherever that inequality grows, women and girls are going to be the worst hit. I'll give you specific examples of it and in how to tell the story. Women and girls are the worst hit, and the greater the inequality gaps grow, the greater they suffer, particularly Dalits, Adivasis and poor OBCs. Inequality is not caste neutral. It's not caste neutral. Because of the very strong links in the countryside between your occupational caste and your economic condition. Interestingly, Forbes puts out its billionaires list each year on March 8th, International Women's Day. I don't know, maybe it's an aspirational thing or something like that. Because there aren't too many. There aren't too many of them. There are, but not too many of them. Now, so the promise of capitalism is that if you work hard enough, if hard work made you a billionaire, as people before me have pointed out, but I'm putting it to you in this way, if hard work makes you a billionaire, every woman in rural India and 80% of them in urban India would be a billionaire. Every woman in the continent of Africa would be a billionaire. Right? But what we know is that 22 global billionaires own more money, own more wealth than all the women of Africa put together. You're looking at stunning levels of inequality. Now, these 166 individuals, their total wealth in 2021 was roughly $794 billion, which was about 27% of your gross domestic product, lending emphasis to the whole other meaning of gross. That's 0.000014% of the population, controlling 27% of GDP. That is simply a horrendous figure. Now, if you look at care work in rural women worldwide, they spend up to 14 hours a day doing that, which is 5 times, I'm giving you figures from Oxfam and its interpretation of ILO and other data, which is up to 5 times what the men in their communities do in care work. So I'm saying it's not just that she's denied the payment. Yeah, so she's denied the opportunities of study, of learning, of developing skills with these technologies, which actually work against her in the real world. The story I want to tell of informal workers, the stories that I want to tell of them are the stories where they get organized formally. That's what I want to see happen. All your big labor movements came out of people who were originally informal. The aim should not be to say, oh, I don't like big unions. The aim should be, let me build my own. Or also work for greater gender parity within those. That's what we ought to be doing. So the ways of going about it, one is you completely discard the present definitions and ideas of growth in GDP. And I think that you look at it through a prism of justice, growth through justice, or just first focus on the justice. The second in India, I would say, is that we need to, they are there in your constitution. To my mind, the soul of the constitution is the directive principles of state policy. The right to work, the right to this. And that would have to include the right to minimum wage. There are states in the country where the NREGS wage is lower than the state's minimum wage. So all these things you have to throw out. The directive principles of state policy allow you a lot of leeway on right to work, right to health, right to food implied in that, health and nutrition. And the first thing it says is that it is the duty of the state to minimize inequality, that equal pay for equal work, and that the health and of women and children shall not ever be neglected. If you can't unify your people on upholding their constitution, what can you unify them on?
My next question to you is, could you tell us about a story that you have worked on about women coming together or organizing, as you call it, either of a women's collective enterprise or a labor movement that is led by women?
For me, on what I have worked on, Kudumbashree is a spectacular example. In 20 years of the agrarian crisis, 15 of those years, they were the only small farmers. Kudumbashree is lots of things. It's into, you'll find on Thrissur, all women auto repair shops who will repair your car as well or probably better than any B.Tech. So they have various little units. For me, the heart of it is about 300,000 women who are in 70,000 little collectives called Sangha Krishis, that is group farming. Now the size of the land on which these collectives work is 1 acre to 2 acres. On 1 acre you might have 4 women, 1 unit. The biggest unit will be 10 women working on. I think that I learnt one economic concept from them. That is, they were not at all impressed with talk of food security, food sovereignty. They taught me the value of the approach being food justice, which is based on the principle the producer shall never go hungry. So suppose you produce 2,000 quintals of paddy, it must first meet the needs of the families of those women, because each woman is seen as representing Kudumbam, Kudumbashri. It must satisfy the demands of those families, and then you can sell the rest on the market. In the countryside, I am seeing in farm household after farm household, generations of children growing up without milk because they have to sell the milk commercially in order to have other essentials at home. It's appalling. I mean, imagine that a farm child who doesn't drink milk. Yet another thing is that that's not going to happen without public action and struggle. And that's where I think, that's what I think Kudumbashri women have achieved. They did extremely well. Women with Kudumbashri background did much better than any other women in the local bodies elections, because people are seeing them as problem solvers in their village.
So I'm going to take us back to something very interesting you said, which was you don't tell the story, they tell they tell the story. And in that context, the way the problems of development are framed, or the language that we use to designate them, can themselves be a form of power and continue to, in some ways, exacerbate these inequalities. Therefore, it is important, as you say, to represent people as they see themselves, or for them to tell the story themselves. Given that women hold multiple roles, and very often they don't see themselves as workers, how do we begin to put the power back into their hands?
Actually, I think they have an advantage. Women, grandmothers, mothers are far better storytellers than the men. In November, my new book will come out. It's on the last living freedom fighters.
Wow.
8 of them have died while the book is being done. 8 of them are alive. And you will see one of the differences is 5 of them are women, which you will not find in any history books on freedom struggle. And you will see that the women, the first story starts with Hausabai Patil from Maharashtra. You see the story she tells. It's happening before your eyes when you read but it is what skills we bring as journalists to frame that story in a way that will entrance a younger generation. So one, as I said, it requires an enormous amount of persuasion to win the confidence of that person. And in the 10,000 photographs I put up for our archive, you will not find a single woman self-conscious, or simply because I stayed in the house of those I photographed. On the 3rd or 4th day, they get accustomed to you as part of the furniture. In an interview, very often, I don't bring out the recorder or the camera till very late. It may mean having to repeat whole sections. But I don't. First thing I go and set up lights, camera, this thing. Immediately the person is self-conscious. You need to have an unobtrusive approach to that. You need to spend a lot of time. You are going to someone's house and asking the most intrusive questions. Why the hell should she tell you how much her husband drinks? Who are you? Yeah. And yet I ask those questions all the time. But I ask it when I have her confidence.
A relationship.
Or I am in the company of someone who has totally her confidence. Yeah. Third, with women, the best stories will come when the men are not around. One of the things that you mentioned was what that lady said from the Adivasi group, that most of us think of ourselves as unimportant. In my book, there is maybe the most extraordinary character, a 104-year-old woman, still in good shape, who spent 2.5 hours telling me I had nothing to do with the freedom struggle. I did nothing in the freedom struggle. A lot of people, a lot of women, as you know very well, better than me, absorb the stereotypes of what a woman's role and contribution is. So this went on for hours. And she said, people asked, I said, so what did you do? And she said, I ran this joint family of 20, 25 people. I grew the food. I transported the food. I did all the cooking. And then there was this husband who would bring his friends, and I had to feed them. I said it must have been very hard when your husband was imprisoned for 13 months after the attack on the Purulia police station. It must have been very hard. She said it was much worse when he came back. He came back with another 20 people whom I had to feed. And you know who she was feeding? She was feeding 20 to 25 revolutionaries underground, hiding in the forests and growing food and feeding them at the height of the Bengal famine. Now, if that isn't a contribution to the freedom struggle, I don't know what the hell is. Very important to get the women to reinterpret and come out with the centrality of their role. So there are so many of them who have absorbed those stereotypes. From when you're a girl able to understand anything at all, you understand that your role is secondary or whatever it is. Right? So that is something else as you've got to get them out of. You have to make it clear that you are open to being asked equally intrusive questions by them. They can also ask you questions. They don't know that, or they don't assume that they have the right because you're the big city slicker. So you have to tell them that you can ask me any questions you want about. You can tell them even before you begin. And many of them will ask. Maybe not at the beginning, maybe at the end, but they will ask. And they will surely then ask you the question of what are you getting out of this and what am I getting out of it. Yeah. So there's a number of things you do. Let them tell the story. Then we do the research for the context of that period. And that's how I think storytelling is done. It's not the reporter who is primary. It's the reported who are the primary.
You see, the internet is a whole different world, and informal women, like you said, don't have access. I mean, access to technology is one thing, and then therefore are also not so much on the internet. But your work with PARI has been an incredible kind of documentation or archival of a very large section of society. How, according to you, can women in the informal sector reclaim the internet? Given the digital divide,
I think
various divides.
Why are we making them responsible for the reclaim? All of us have to do it.
Absolutely.
With them, for us. And there are lots of people, and there are groups and non-profits, etc., who are trying to work with marginalized communities and technology. Now, in our given society, technology tends to work against them. Right. Therefore, it's good that groups are trying to sort that balance. But in the internet, look, four guys sorry, they're all guys, control the net. The digital monopolies are the greatest monopolies in the history of the human race and the nastiest. One feature sets them apart from all earlier monopolies. No other monopoly in the world owned and traffics in your personal data. These guys own your personal data. You write her a mail that I'm thinking of going to Rio and Sao Paulo for a holiday. How many thousand ads will you get in your mail? You've been algorithmed out of your intellect there with that. So that gives them an unrivaled power over the human race. They have to be broken, and they have to be broken really, really fast. And I'm very glad that some of them tend to break themselves. At that stage, when you're a gargantuan monster, things happen like it's happened with Zuckerberg and with Twitter. But still, four companies dominate the net. Now, at the same time, then why are we on the net? Because there are still autonomous zones, or what you can call zones of relative autonomy. Then comes the next problem. See, the internet guarantees you a voice. It doesn't guarantee you that anyone is going to listen. Because that's mediated by these four guys.
Correct.
Anything you do, they'll charge. Now, you may have 1 million followers on Facebook. You can't reach more than 2% of them without payment.
Yeah.
After that, it's got to be paid posts. So it's like if I was the bank manager and I will not allow you to access your bank account except on the days, the time, and the purpose for which I feel it is okay. These are squatters on the net. It wasn't created by their investments.
That's a great way of putting it, squatters on the net.
Yeah. So there, I think, anti-monopoly legislation is a must. And by the way, Europe has been doing some of it with Google. So it's not impossible.
This trend of, data privacy, surveillance is, there's drones coming and mapping your agriculture land now and collecting God knows what data. What are the challenges or fears that you have for our farming economy?
We are living in the national surveillance state. We're doing that. And the fears, it's, Pegasus is the thin end of the wedge. Yeah. You'll find that many journalists maintain since then a second phone on which they don't use any apps that can be used as Trojan horses like WhatsApp is. WhatsApp is the quintessential Trojan horse. They themselves said it 2 years ago. 14,400 accounts in India have been compromised, a large number of them by journalists. But your thing is related to what she said. I'm saying you can do things on the net. PARI is entirely a net-based organization, but it's an unending uphill struggle. Now, I know, we have 2.3 million page views a year. But I know for the work we are doing and the quality of what we are doing, it ought to be incredibly higher. But we can't reach because of all the problem with the information highway is all those highwaymen out there. That's the problem. But we have to work on the principle of what we call democratizing the net, decolonizing the net. That's what we have to work for. And you see today in Hindi journalism, I think the best stuff is coming on the, apart from Ravish, who is the best, the only exciting stuff happening in Hindi journalism is happening on little individual YouTube channels. They're really good. Some of them are horrible, some of them are wonderful. So it's a question of fighting for democratization, what I call democratization of the digital. You have to break monopoly. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was
Welcome.
a very exciting conversation.
It was an incredible conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed listening to this conversation, do share it with your friends and family. If you would like to collaborate or partner with us or get in touch with our women's cooperatives, write to us at communications@sevafederation.org. That is communications@SEWAFEDERATION.org. We'll be back with another guest and another episode. Until then, stay tuned to InSolidarity.